So yeah, we have a question from last week from Sebastian via Discord. He asked, "Hi, I'm 27 years old, got blood test results today. So far, total testosterone seems pretty low, even if in range. Total testosterone 4.21 ng/ml, free testosterone 21.7 pg/ml. Comments? Thank you."
So it sounds like this caller has gotten their total and free testosterone levels checked, which is great. And I think we've talked about in previous radio shows. I actually suggest all adult men, as part of their annual physical exam, do a routine blood test, and if they're willing, also to check their hormone levels, just to make sure that you're not having low testosterone, but also making sure that they're optimal as well. So you can't sort of interpret it without the reference ranges. What a reference range is usually when you get a lab result, you also get what's called a reference range. And usually that's a 95% confidence interval. So it'll say for, men, adult men, this is basically the 2.5 percentile to the 97.5 percentile, and kind of the 95 percentiles in between. So if you're within the normal range, or you're within that bound, which applies to 95% of people, then your levels are considered normal. The thing that I think is really important to distinguish, though, is just because your levels are not abnormal does not mean your hormone levels or any other reference range are optimal. There's a difference between abnormal and unoptimal. Abnormal, by definition, means your levels have to be in the 2.5 percentile or lower, which is really, really low testosterone levels. If you're looking at like a total testosterone level, and most of the reference ranges are usually between like 300 and 900, I believe, nanograms per deciliter, if I'm getting the units right. This person, I think, chimed in and you said it was like 4.21. This is a different scale, essentially, that they're using. So it's hard for me to interpret. But most of the time, total testosterone is kind of in that 300 to 900 range. Your levels would have to be in kind of the 200s or lower to be considered deficient, or what's clinically called hypogonadal. But that doesn't mean it's optimal, right? Like your levels could be in the 5th percentile, meaning 95% of guys are higher than you, and you're still considered normal. So reference ranges are really only telling you if you're extreme, essentially, right? You have an extreme abnormality, or same thing on the higher end, that you're extremely high in some rare cases. I generally think kind of 300 to 900 is the general reference range, but the more like median amount is, I would say, more like 400 to 600 is what like an average guy will have. But I would argue optimal levels are closer to that, 750, 800, 850, 900 range. That would put you in like the 75th, 80th, 90th percentile range. So that's how I would interpret those results. I do think free testosterone is a more useful measure than total testosterone. So just a really, really quick physiological lesson. Testosterone is basically bound to two different proteins. One's called albumin, and the other one is called SHBG, or sex hormone binding globulin. These basically inhibit the function of testosterone in terms of binding to the androgen receptor. And so you measure free testosterone, so that's the unbound form of the testosterone that's not bound to albumin or sex hormone binding globulin, that can freely bind to the androgen receptor. So that's the one that's responsible for the biological activity, like building muscle, that people associate with testosterone. The only tricky thing about free testosterone, though, is you have to make sure that you're measuring the right kind. If you go to a Quest or a LabCorp, which are the two major labs in the United States, make sure if you're going and getting the test, that first of all, it's LCMS. LCMS is liquid chromatography mass spectrometry. It's just basically a more accurate version of the test versus what's called an immunoassay. And then on top of that, you want to make sure you're getting the right LCMS test. I know this is very complicated, but Quest, if you go to Quest, automatically their LCMS test is the right one, and that's an equilibrium dialysis. That's considered the gold standard, the most accurate version of free testosterone. If you go to LabCorp, however, you have to specify that. So I think there's two ones that are good, two types of tests that are good. One's called equilibrium dialysis. The other one's called ultrafiltration method. They're both LCMS tests. Those are what are considered the more accurate free testosterone measures. If you just kind of get the immunoassay free testosterone, it's directionally accurate. I'm not saying it's totally inaccurate, but it's not as good as the gold standards. So that's the best way. That's the most accurate way to measure free testosterone. If you don't have sort of the time or money or means to go get that, the easier way of doing it is just get your total testosterone level checked. I do prefer LCMS for that test as well. That's a little bit more accurate than the LCMS. But the other thing you can do is if you're getting it done as part of your routine blood work, albumin is automatically measured as part of a CBC or CMP. And so you'll know that number. And then you're going to ask for a second test, which is that SHBG protein that I mentioned. Basically, my recommendation is get a total testosterone and an SHBG and then calculate it yourself, or get a very accurate free testosterone. But if you do, make sure you get the right one, which is an LCMS equilibrium dialysis test. So I know that was a lot. If you have any questions, just go to our Discord channel. We have a Dr. Cam radio show, and I'll type these things out so that you can have them for your reference. And you can bring it up with your doctor when you want to ask them about getting these labs measured. So finally, when you get these numbers, you can kind of look up for your age bracket what is kind of age appropriate. Because obviously, if you're 70 versus you're 20, your testosterone levels may be different. They do tend to go down generally about 1% per year. So you kind of like roughly do the math there. So, if you're young, you'd want your testosterone levels, like I said, to be maybe 600-ish, right? The top of that 400 to 600 kind of median range that I mentioned. And it'll kind of slowly decline with age, where if you're kind of middle-aged, maybe it's closer to 500. If you're very elderly, maybe it's closer to 400, right? So I would say, yeah, that's why 400 to 600 is a useful range for everyone. A little bit higher for young people, a little bit lower for older people. You can kind of ballpark yourself. Now, if we're talking about optimization, which I think a lot of people in this community care about, you really want to get to that top of that range, right? I said, like I said, getting to 800, getting to 900, so that you can be essentially kind of an alpha male, if you want to, physiologically describe it as such. There's a lot of things that you can do. I, mentioned some of these on Twitter in terms of the lifestyle behaviors that we should do. Obviously, you should try to get 7 to 9 hours of sleep. There's clear research that shows that testosterone is linearly correlated with up to 8 hours of sleep. So people who get 8 hours of sleep have more testosterone than guys who get 7 or 6 or less hours of sleep. So sleep is by far the best foundational behavior that you can do to make sure that you're endogenously or naturally producing as much testosterone as possible. You should obviously eat a healthy anti-inflammatory diet. Anti-inflammatory meaning, don't eat a bunch of refined, ultra-processed junk food, right? The less nutrition labels, quite frankly, the better. Eat like meat, seafood, produce, fruits, vegetables that don't have any nutrition labels. Those are naturally anti-inflammatory. It's the easiest rule of thumb to follow. The other particular thing, though, if we're talking about hormone optimization, is you do want to consume a reasonable amount of saturated fats, including cholesterol, because that's a substrate for converting into hormones such as testosterone. So like things like egg yolks, red meat, the natural, fatty acids that are found in fish and seafood are all helpful substrates for optimal testosterone production. And the other thing I might say, though, is generally, although I am a fan of lower carb diets, if you're doing extreme low carb or extreme low calories, it may be harmful to testosterone production. So if you're eating 0 carbs, or you're at a less than, let's say, greater than 200 caloric deficit, it may not be optimal. So you can still eat relatively low carb and still be in keto. We've talked about this. If you're dropping weight, you want to do it gradually. So you're cutting, let's say, 100 to 200 calories a day, and you're kind of gradually losing the weight. But if you go on a crash diet and you're doing anything extreme, it can kind of disrupt hormone functioning. So I would just say be careful about doing any sort of extremely low carb, extremely low calorie, or extreme intermittent fasting. Same thing, where you're fasting for very long periods of time. They can kind of screw around with your hormones. So make sure you optimize your nutrition. Obviously, we talked a lot with Ben's question about managing your stress. So make sure your cortisol levels aren't through the roof. Cortisol is catabolic and kind of counteracts the effect of testosterone. Optimal intimate relationships. Obviously, if you're spending time with a partner, you're sexually active, there's a lot of touch and intimacy involved, that can actually increase testosterone levels. We are social creatures. There's in fact even evidence that like rooting for your favorite team and having them win at a baseball or football game increases your testosterone, at least temporarily or acutely. But yeah, you don't discount the social factor, as well. And then same thing, if you're spending so much time in front of a computer, I don't think there's a lot of clear research on this, but mechanistically it makes sense that if you're addicted to the internet, pornography, gaming, and you're spending, hours a day on it, it's probably not going to be optimal for your testosterone versus getting outside in the sun, spending time in clean, fresh air, and getting vitamin D produced through the conversion in your skin is going to be much better for your testosterone production, I would argue, than sitting under a bunch of artificial light and the glow of the computer screen. So make sure you're, getting sunlight and getting enough endogenous vitamin D production. Obviously, if you live, it's wintertime in a place that doesn't get a lot of sun, you may want to optimize your vitamin D levels in order to have that support your testosterone levels. This is something that our company is working on as well. We're going to have some very, very interesting, cool stuff that we'll talk about later that can help people really get up to those optimal ranges, just like professional athletes and people who are functioning at a very high performance level.